Three, two. Kia ora koutou katoa, everyone. I'm Bernard Hickey here in Hoon Bay in Auckland, but Peter Bale, our co-host from somewhere exotic. Where are you, Peter?
Oh, Bernard, hola. I'm in Spain. I've buggered up my own broadband, but I'm sitting in my bedroom in Spain,
Ah, fantastic to see you.
in
For
southern Spain. It probably might be a bit echoey in my bedroom, but at least
no,
I
no,
don't have bras and things hanging over the door handle that we did at one point.
no. This is for those regular viewers of the Hoon. You will know of Peter's various overseas bureau. It's lovely to have you on, and I hope that it's a nice, calm Europe. Maybe it's warm. Maybe
It's not, yeah,
it's
it's good.
busy.
It's good. Yeah, yeah. But it's early in the morning, but I've got up and made my coffee. I don't have a gin and tonic today, unfortunately. But
Ah, no,
even I don't start at 7 in the morning with a gin and tonic.
yeah, no. It's been a heck of a week here. I know you've been travelling, Peter, but we've had plenty of action around politics with three waters becoming 10 waters, but no change in co-governance and also no change in the off-balance sheet structure. I wrote quite a lot about that this week. The government made the announcement with Kieran McAnulty being quite different in his approach to Nanaia Mahuta, where he ended the press conference by saying, "Well, I think I nailed that,"
Yeah.
and and certainly that was interesting. And we also had
He actually he sort of let his inner voice come out, did he?
yeah, at the end he said, "Oh, we nailed that,"
Yeah, I
and
don't think
that's
so. Yeah.
far from true because when you actually look at what has happened, there's really not been much change. Sure, they've changed the name from Three Waters to Affordable Water,
Oh, Jesus. Affordable
and
water. So this is getting the number of things that this government is abandoning in a desperate race towards the election is absolutely extraordinary. You know,
yeah,
Auckland intensification. You know, what the hell's going on? There's most of the climate change stuff. They've kind of papered over that Treasury report or the report earlier this week about the scale of the gap in the climate change requirement on buying carbon credits. I mean, this is they're throwing away everything of the last 5 years in a desperate attempt to get to the election. I think
yeah, anything that
affordable
looks
water.
affordable
Bloody
water,
hell!
which actually,
Who
when
came
you
up with
when
that?
you look at it, is actually not much more than a description of what they say are going to be big rates increases, but not quite as
Yeah.
big as they'd expected,
Yes. Yes.
from a piece of modelling that goes out to 2054. I don't know about you, but I've never modelled my own finances out to 2054. I have no
Yes.
idea.
Well, we might
No,
have to, Brenda. Yeah.
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 And the government really is in clear the decks mode, essentially presenting as low a target as it possibly can. It's crawling along the ground, hoping that it can avoid being shot by the opposition, who are
This is surely indefensible water now. I mean, it's just what on earth do they stand for? If the I'm
getting
interested that
re-elected.
co-governance is still there, and I would recommend, at the risk of promoting other people's podcasts that are clearly much less successful than ours, but Nikki Maddow's piece for the detail on what co-governance is absolutely superb, and it's the kind of thing that should have been done a lot more of in the last 2 years or so to explain it, because it works. It isn't necessarily anti-democratic, and it helps to fulfil our obligations that we've signed up to in terms of Indigenous people.
That's right. I think the whole process is performative and a waste of time because what it essentially was trying to do is convince voters that they can have the infrastructure and not have to pay for it, when actually shifting these assets off council and government balance sheets mean that they can borrow money, but they're going to pay for that by increasing water charges. And actually, when you look at the cost of it, it's actually cheaper for the Crown to borrow the money up front. And we've seen that because Kāinga Ora, who was off balance sheet, have been brought back on balance sheet because turns out it's cheaper to do it that way. And this is all about the government not wanting to ask to increase charges and taxes. And it's a problem for the opposition too, because they of course don't want to introduce charges or taxes, but they also want to give the suggestion that they are doing something about the infrastructure shortages as our population rises very fast. And we got numbers today from Stats NZ showing net migration up to 52,000 already.
Hmm.
Now, that is double the long-term forecast from Stats NZ about our population growth. And it means that, yet again, we are turning on the migration taps to try to, in theory, solve our economic issues in the short term
Mm.
and only stressing our
And
infrastructure
we'll and
out.
we'll and we're stressing the infrastructure that we're not terribly good at developing. Speaking of immigration, there's Professor Patman.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, hi Bernard. Hi Peter.
G'day, Robert. Great to see you.
Good to see you.
Nice headphones, Robert.
Yeah, well, thank
Are
you,
you
Bernard.
listening to hip
That's
hop? What?
We're,
the
we're,
Hoon.
we're
Compliments to the Hoon.
compliments of the Hoon. Yeah, no, we're all about the headphones on the Hoon. And Robert, I'm very interested to see from China and Taiwan and the bit of the sea between the two. There's been plenty of action over the last week or so, which luckily has avoided turning into something nasty. But
So
it
far.
really is becoming quite heated and dangerous there.
Yes, the Chinese, in their own words, have given Taiwan a very stern warning. Carried out, I think, 3 to 4 days worth of military drills, and as you indicated, Bernard, these drills were pretty invasive, involving lots of planes, and also what the Americans who monitored the whole thing said were attempts at precision targeting, and also practicing a blockade. So, I think the message is that to the Taiwan leader, Tsai Ing-wen, that she, of course, ignored warnings about going to the United States and meeting with Kevin McCarthy, and that this seemed to be a sort of a final warning: don't do it again. If we warn you not to go somewhere, take us seriously, because otherwise the practice run may develop into something a little bit
Mm.
more lethal. That seems to be the message, doesn't it?
Yeah, and it was interesting that this time around there were the most incursions by warplanes from China into
Mm.
Taiwan airspace. China is also now aggressively and in quite a detailed way using its own aircraft carrier, the Shandong,
Mm.
which it built and which is the first real large scale indication of projecting power beyond your borders. Up until now, really, they're so expensive to build, support, that really only America has been able to support
Mm.
aircraft carrier battle groups, because it's not just the aircraft carrier, you have got to have a
Mm.
whole bunch of other ships around it to stop
Sure.
it being sunk. And so the Shandong is in there in the Straits of Taiwan, flying planes off it, and uh, they're also, doing their own thing. They went within 12 miles of the Mischief Reef, I think it is. This is
Yep.
the
Making that's actually
artificially
called the Making Mischief Reef. Yeah.
making Mischief Reef.
Yeah.
So, Robert, I just wondered, closely should people in New Zealand be watching this situation?
Well, I think they should be watching it closely because, of course, as we all know, China is our major export destination. The thing about China, which is puzzling me, and be interesting to hear your views, Peter and Bernard, that in a sense, China is sort of huffing and puffing and carrying out these practice blockades, etc., etc. But in a sense, the consequences if China carried through one of these threats against Taiwan, I think would be pretty counterproductive for the Chinese economy, because the Americans and the Europeans, I think, would follow through with pretty extensive sanctions and constraints on their exports. That's Chinese exports. And then, of course, Taiwan is a major international provider
Mm.
of chips, isn't it? I think you mentioned this, Bernard, once
Mm.
before, microchips. And it would have catastrophic consequences, I think, in the long term, maybe not in the short term, for China's role in the global economy. So, I think China, there must be, I can't help thinking that behind closed doors, there must be some voices saying to Xi, actually, you've got to be careful how far you go in these threats, because if we do follow through, it could be bad news for, you know, communist political control, because
Mm.
after all, that is based on the prosperity of the Chinese economy. And if China's leadership takes steps to undermine that prosperity, they will be accountable. Although it sounds strange in a one-party state saying they'll be accountable, but one thing we think they may be accountable for is when the economy is no longer growing impressively or performing well. And as we've said many times before, sometimes American commentators and Russian commentators talk as if China achieved superpower status independently of the rest of the world. It didn't. It got there with the compliments of the West. And
Yeah.
it's still, the Chinese economy is still critically dependent on exports to the United States and the EU and Japan. And none of those actors are likely to take it lightly if China, followed through one of its threats against Taiwan. So it's fascinating.
But they learn a lot,
Fascinating
Robert.
posering.
I would argue that they learn a tremendous amount from the huffing and puffing.
Right.
It costs them very little. It's an extremely effective exercise. Every aircraft that goes into that restricted zone or reporting zone teaches them something about what the response might be.
Right.
And it's also, this is not my normal stance on this, but it is a statement against U.S. hegemony, and they're not prepared. Of course, the United States has and Australia and New Zealand have perfect rights to, theoretically perfect rights to go through the South China Sea and sail in these open waters and so on. But they're putting a marker down about what they consider to be their business. And I still believe, Robert, and there's certain of your colleagues who disagree with me on this, that we still have to find a way to engage, and that New Zealand ought to be extremely careful about how it steps closer to AUKUS and so on this.
Yeah, I think New Zealand's. I agree with you on the last point. I think New Zealand has to frame a foreign policy that makes it quite clear to China that we won't be taking a backward step on our core values, but on areas where we can agree, we're prepared to be constructive. And that is to say, I think the government has tried to do this by refusing to pigeonhole China and Russia together. Although, of course, China has been its own worst enemy in this respect with its wolf warrior diplomacy and its support for Putin, which I think has gone down very badly. And apparently, our foreign minister, Nanaia Mahuta, did raise this issue in Beijing with the Chinese leadership, saying
Which
that
we might know if she'd taken any reporters with her.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. No,
I thought you were on the
unfortunately-
plane with her, Peter.
Yeah, well, usually I am in spirit. Yeah.
And Robert too. This dance, I suppose you could call it, or this jostling of elbows in the geopolitics, got an extra frisson this week when.
Oh, very nice segue, Bernard.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's very good. Yeah.
When Emmanuel Macron decided to mount off about what he thinks China and the EU should be doing with each other. Tell us about what's going on there.
Well, I wish I could. I mean, Mr. Macron at times struggles to impose intellectual coherence on his foreign policy, and it may be to do with domestic politics, where of course he's been having a very bad time, and he uses foreign policy in a sense to show that France, under his leadership, has an independent a role to play. I don't know. I mean, I wonder if he was doing that, but I mean, I think that the point here being with Mr. Macron is that the Chinese, of course, received his comments very favourably, which added to the sense of irritation in Washington and Germany. Actually, Germany was not impressed by his comments, and he seems to be a maverick. I mean,
But again, Robert, isn't he actually doing what the sensible thing and saying, let's not get hauled into, particularly through rhetoric, a conflict over Taiwan. He's not, I think he's saying that the EU is big enough and needs to be big enough to have its own foreign policy, even if it's aligned to the United States, but it needs to be independent of the United States. It goes back again to this. I mean, he knows we could be looking at Trump in 2024 as well.
Yeah, but there's another side to that coin, Peter. Macron, by making such noises, may be bringing about the very thing he doesn't want. After all, he made soothing noises and said even after the Russian illegal invasion of Ukraine, he was saying that he could give Europe could give security guarantees to Putin when he couldn't. And now he's saying, at a time when China's been carrying out these very provocative drills round of territory, by the way, which the Communist Party has never ruled over of China. China's never actually controlled Taiwan.
No.
He's saying that France does not want to see be dragged into a situation in a sense and become a follower of the United States.
Yeah.
I think that you may have a point. I think Europe can assert its independence without being seen to try to find favour with either Putin or Xi Jinping.
Yeah, but I think
I
we
think
do
it's
have to
quite
go. We
possible.
do have to find some. We do have to find some middle ground here, where we're part of the alliance, part of defense. Not we. I mean, it's certainly the European Union. I mean, this is a very This reminds me of Mitterrand. Chirac did a very similar thing about Iraq. This is essentially saying we have our own minds on these issues, and that's
Yeah,
surely got to be welcomed.
but they need to back it up with action. It's all very well saying they've got a distinctive position, but look, France has given less to support Ukraine than the Netherlands has. It's about
Really?
10th in the
Wow.
pecking order. And, Macron spent the first 5 or 6 months of the Ukraine invasion in trying to come up with a land for peace deal.
Yeah.
Which
So
only
do we call this
encourage-
the force to flip flop?
Yeah. So, again, I think, unfortunately, that Mr. Macron's stand on issues like the Ukraine has alienated much of the other members of the EU, not least the Eastern European members. So I don't think he's got any position to speak for the EU. And if you compare his comments with that of the High Representative for Foreign Policy, Joseph Borrell, he's made quite uncompromising comments about Taiwan. So
Yeah.
whose foreign policy is he representing? I think yes, you can understand the criticism from the United States because they feel that France hasn't acknowledged what the United States is trying to do, both with respect to Taiwan but also in Ukraine. But I think there's a lot of frustration in Europe as well because they feel that Mr. Macron, they don't know what next is going to come out of his mouth, and he's speaking as if he represents them all when he clearly doesn't.
Robert, just
I
on,
wonder-
on the Taiwan question, I was most interested in thinking about. In fact, I was looking at a map the other day of Taiwan, which was showing these incursions, and also The Economist had a very good piece about a trip to Kinmen, the Kinmen Islands, which is a little tiny pocket of islands just off Fujian, and it's actually you can see, which means that you can see Taiwanese territory from the Chinese mainland. It'll be very interesting to think about whether, and there's also disputes on those islands about whether there needs to be a rapprochement with China to some extent. It would be very interesting to see whether the security guarantees extended to those little 3 groups of islands that are, really tucked into sort of coves in a way, harbours on the mainland rather than mainland Taiwan itself. And it wouldn't surprise me if the Chinese did pick one of those off at some point for an incursion in order to test that, in the same way we're talking about the bluff and bluster in this case.
I just wonder too whether New Zealand has to be a little bit careful. There's been quite a bit of interesting commentary around New Zealand's relationship with NATO. It seems weird, the North Atlantic Treaty Organisation. What on earth is New Zealand doing mucking around on the edges there? There's some suggestion that we're part of some sort of informal bolt-on extra called the IP4 or something. And there's even talk of an invitation to Chris Hipkins to go to speak to NATO, a NATO conference in a couple of weeks' time, which
Well,
he
should
might.
have. Jacinda has twice now.
That's, yeah, and we all thought it was
And
just
it is all about
just a
the
Jacinda
Indo-Pacific
thing.
now, Bernard.
Yeah, but no, but it looks like they're quite interested in New Zealand's view on this. Robert, do you think there's much going on that's real here around NATO, or should we just say yes to every invitation just so we can play with the big
I think there's
boys
a great deal of
occasionally?
misunderstanding about the relationship between New Zealand and NATO. This goes back quite a long way. We got involved with NATO in Afghanistan from 2003. And then in 2012, John Key went to Brussels and signed an agreement to become a partner of NATO. And so it's a long-standing relationship. And, a lot of people believe that any involvement in NATO will be a sellout of New Zealand's principled independent foreign policy. Actually, I think it's the other way round. New Zealand has always taken the view, because it's a relatively small country, that it has to uphold multilateralism and the rules-based order. And one thing we like about NATO is that most of their members are liberal democracies, and we get on famously with several of them. Um, and we see eye to eye. We have a much closer worldview, actually, to some members of NATO than we do with the United States, or for that matter, UK. But in addition, we actually want a multilateral approach to problems that don't respect borders. And therefore, in a sense, there's a logical fit between New Zealand's approach to security and the NATO organisation, which is a defensive organisation and can't make decisions without consensus.
Yeah,
And
it's
so,
interesting, Robert. Also, our Five Eyes and the fact that we do appear to be weirdly, despite and again, I always hate this being a sort of plucky New Zealand public punching above its weight story, but it is true that New Zealand plays an important role in Five Eyes, and that we have people in NATO headquarters and in the British High Command at the moment, assisting particularly with Ukraine intelligence, which takes us to the intelligence discussion and the possible implications for Five Eyes of this rather embarrassing US leak. And I was reading something about that last night, about the importance of it, because if you think about the difference between this and the WikiLeaks leaks, which Julian Assange has been, effectively in prison for in the United States, in the UK for 5 years, waiting judgments on extradition, let alone his 8 years in the Ecuador embassy, and Chelsea Manning. This is much more significant in the sense because it's almost immediate. It's real. It's almost real time. Some of the intelligence that's come out so far was from March, and it's about a real active conflict. It isn't about methods and history.
it is an extraordinary development, and the more we learn about, because this young man who's been arrested in the last 24 hours as being responsible, he actually shared this information with a select group of people. And then it was someone within that group who actually leaked the information.
Yeah, a select group of people who celebrate weapons,
Yeah,
anti-Semitism, and racism.
absolutely.
I'm not in any way. That I want to see
I'm not in any way defending his choice of friends, but I was shocked that he was shocked that one of them was tempted to leak it. I was extraordinarily reckless to share confidential information with even a small circle of people who are not connected professionally. So it was just an extraordinary thing to do. What I found interesting about this particular leak, and I do agree with you, this has very big ramifications for example, China, and also Five Eyes, and both, of course. But also, what was particularly interesting is that although this information was quite damaging, it led to feverish speculation. What was the motivation behind the leak? But we're now beginning. There was first of all, there was the view that there was a disgruntled person within the Pentagon who didn't like American support for Ukraine and therefore tried to put these leaks out to embarrass. Then there was the countervailing view that, in fact, there was someone who was disgruntled in the Pentagon with a lack of American support and wanted to actually beef up by these leaks, showing that Ukraine could run out of munitions for their air defense systems,
as opposed to a nasty little egotist showing off and showing off.
And now it looks that the reality is now beginning to look a little bit more sobering.
What I found interesting about this is that what was this guy showing off to his mates in a Discord server eventually got out, and that it was the alternative, independent, I suppose, gatherers of information online, Bellingcat, and other journalists who actually found the guy. Peter, you've had a bit to
with Bellingcat. Yeah, I have.
Yeah, and they're doing extraordinary work in a way, and
they're so forensic. I mean, people there's on the right wing, or at least on the sort of weird Glenn Greenwald side of journalism and media, there's a lot of hostility towards Bellingcat because it has a lot of former military people in it, and it it's a non-profit which gets money from various but it's all fully disclosed. I mean, really, they have not exactly invented, but almost invented the whole concept of open source intelligence. And as you say, they were talking to the English guy, I think, who transposted a lot of the stuff onto a Korean music hip hop site. That's where we've got to. I mean, quite how many sites you have to patrol to find the crumbs through the internet of moving from a Discord server with a with a nasty little racist in America sharing this with his friends, and into Korean hip hop. It's quite interesting. But there will be, there can potentially be serious consequences for this, because for one of the things that we've talked about quite a lot since the beginning of the Ukraine conflict is this dramatic shift in the use of U.S. intelligence and the transparency of putting out this information. And this now shows, to some extent, quite the depth of the extent of the Americans' ability to listen in or get human intelligence potentially, but particularly in the Russian hierarchy. And that, you might see some people falling out of windows fairly soon as a result, I would have thought.
Yeah, well, let's hope that was the last of it that came out. And
No,
the moral of
there's
the story.
there's 300 pages, I think, and we've only had about 60 so far.
All right, well, we should watch this space. And by the way, I'd recommend everyone buy the book We Are Bellingcat, Global Crime, Online Sleuths, and the Bold Future of News by Elliot Higgins, which is a cracking yarn.
Who started this in his bedroom, literally, like me.
Yeah. Robert Patman, thank you very much,
you so much,
from
Robert.
the
You're very welcome.
University of Otago. Lovely to whip around the world of geopolitics in the first half hour of the show.
Great
And thank you, Robert. And it's wonderful to invite in a new guest to the Hoon, Rebecca Peer from the University of Canterbury, who is an expert in climate change and energy, and has been very helpful in the past, and to me in particular, in putting together a podcast for When the Facts Change at the Spin-Off. Rebecca, thank you very much for coming on to the Hoon.
Thanks for having me.
Now, it's been a big week in the world of climate change news in New Zealand, and maybe you might have missed the beginning of the news bulletins and the front pages of the other media outlets, but we're really focused on this. So, starting off with the Climate Commission, which put out some recommendations to the government in its very careful, lawyerly, bureaucratic way, essentially saying the government wasn't doing enough to improve its climate emissions reductions. Could you give us a sense of, how important the Climate Commission's recommendations this week was?
Yeah, I think, bit of a personal opinion, but I think it's hugely important. I mean, we know that this is a massive issue. We've made this big global commitment and we've set these targets, and time is running out for us to take action, right? No matter what decision we're going to make, now is the time. There's no time for us to be deciding between what we're going to do and if we're going to do it. And, we'll assess the options and we'll take a long time to decide. We're at the point where we need to start doing things, and we need to do them now. 2030 targets are starting to look very, very close. That 2025 budget year for the carbon budget is right around the corner, essentially. And so taking action needs to happen now. And I would say, buried in between the very nice presentation of that message from the Climate Change Commission, I see that coming through as someone who studies climate change, softly delivered, but we need to do stuff, and we need to do it now. And I think that's coming through clearly. We need to take greater action. And one of the policy levers to do that is the emissions trading scheme.
Yeah, so for those who haven't been following it, we've been covering it on the Kaka. And just before Christmas, the Cabinet decided not to make some changes recommended by the Climate Commission to the emissions trading scheme, which would have effectively increased the price of carbon credits and increased the price of petrol, which, when you're talking all the time about bread and butter and affordability, is not something you want to do 9 months before an election. So the government essentially decided to choose popularity and low petrol prices over agreeing with the recommendations of the Climate Commission. And but there is a potential cost here for taxpayers, and we found out a bit more about this week from the Treasury, which put out a paper with the Ministry for the Environment and analysing the fiscal risks. How much it might cost if we miss our targets. Could you give us a bit of a rundown on what are the potential risks here for New Zealand if we don't hit our targets under the Paris Agreement?
Yeah, I mean, and it's not just a risk that we're experiencing, it's a risk that everyone is experiencing. Every overshoot from those targets is going to contribute more and more to climate change. That's going to increase the severity and the frequency of those impacts that we hear often, large scale hazards, increasing heat, and all of that has cascading impacts throughout our day to day life. And, what we're able to do and how we interact and where we can live, and, how we experience the world. And so it's a big problem. And every bit that we overshoot is going to have lasting impacts. Those greenhouse gases that we emit, particularly carbon dioxide, stay in the atmosphere for 100 years. And so everything that we're doing now, continuing to emit, is still going to have impacts lasting in the future.
Rebecca, do you look at the? I mean, this may be too much of a political question to ask you, but and thanks for coming on. But we've talked quite a bit on this podcast about the promise or the sort of check paid into the future that James Shaw agreed in Copenhagen and in Paris, really, about this whole dependence on future carbon credits bought overseas. It's starting to get attention in New Zealand domestically in a way that it wasn't when Bernard and I were first talking about it some months ago. I got in trouble with Christine Hood, your colleague, for pointing up the David Frame comments about the same thing. I find it hard to believe that New Zealanders are going to accept $24 billion going overseas to overseas carbon credits into a market that doesn't yet exist, to plant trees in Tierra del Fuego, when they don't have infrastructure in the east coast of New Zealand. And I worry that there is I noticed, again, one of these things, it's not just about New Zealand, of course, it's about much bigger countries, but the Netherlands is having a real problem politically getting through its carbon promises with Dutch farmers, and there's an anti-climate change, if you like, or anti-climate change measures party that is now starting to become very, very powerful in the Netherlands and pushing back against almost exactly the same kind of problems, that they've got high nitrous oxide levels, they've got a lot of methane, very high livestock, a lot of pigs. We've got similar problems.
Yeah, I think there's a multitude of issues going on here. So obviously we've got the science question and sort of the climate change question. That's one piece of the puzzle. And it's got particular connotations and it's got a timeline associated with it. And then we've sort of got our national politics, complicated as they may be, that also have their own set of values and timelines associated with them as well. Those don't always line up with each other is problem number one. And then the second piece is global cooperation. So in order for us to have this global carbon market where we can buy offsets and everything is sensible, and people are sort of behaving as they intended, or as you intend them to when you purchase those offsets, there needs to be a really high level of global cooperation. That doesn't exist at the moment. So as you pointed out, this market is fledgling at best. And so, yeah, I think it's fair for people to feel uncomfortable with the idea that we'd be spending, billions of dollars into something that we don't really know yet,
Rebecca,
what it looks like.
Aren't politicians going to have to refocus on the domestic challenges in this, and also in a sense, defending the way we farm to some extent, but really looking at that question domestically? I worry that there's going to be, without somebody with the charisma of Jacinda Ardern, although she may have burned all the oil in her tank, as it were, with everything else she dealt with, it's going to be quite hard, it seems, to have a politician with charisma and force. I mean, you've got a government at the moment that before you came on, we were talking about the great ditching of virtually everything that might be even vaguely irritating to a middle-class white voter in New Zealand.
It's a real challenge. Like I highlighted, this political timeline and the political values that may not line up with our goals in terms of climate. That's a massive issue, and it's something that politicians worldwide, but also in New Zealand, are going to have to face up to if they're serious about making important and sustainable and lasting decisions that are going to minimize our impact on the climate. That means trading off with some other things.
It
right?
is a bit of a classic, isn't it? The very short, it's, everybody says that politicians are really good at dealing with what's in front of them, or they think only of what's in front of them, and that climate change is a really difficult one because it's theoretically in the long term, but we now know it's also in the short term.
It
And
is, yeah.
it has a lot of similarities to me with the questions over generative AI, but we can talk about that separately, I think.
Just finally, Rebecca, I wanted to get a sense of just how realistic it is for the Treasury to be forecasting in budgets for the next 4 years that New Zealand could spend up to $3 billion a year on climate emissions credits overseas. When, as I understand it, there aren't that many or any developed markets apart from the EU selling credits, and it would require some really heavy lifting diplomatically by our climate diplomats to do these deals, particularly when there are others, Switzerland, for example, which has been out there rattling the tin, looking for spare trees to plant for quite some time. Could you tell us, how much actual action is there for New Zealand to get in on overseas if we wanted to spend $3 billion?
Yeah, I mean, I'll be honest, I'm not an economist, so I'll just preface that statement here. So, global carbon markets are complicated at the best of times, a complicated subject to broach. But yeah, I think $3 billion is a lot of money to think about when there's a nascent market, and it would be a big challenge, but carbon offsetting has always been an attractive option for issues that are difficult to deal with in the short term. And so I think perhaps reflecting on, what are those issues that are really causing us, those difficulties, and how can we start to think about addressing them as opposed to going down the route of offsetting when that may or may not be a sustainable or stable or even a sensible solution. But all of that analysis relies on us, behaving sensibly and thinking sensibly about how we're tackling this climate change issue, which is a pretty massive caveat.
Yeah.
That rather
Rebecca,
don't worry about not being an economist. That's never stopped us talking about something we don't know about.
Rebecca, thank you very much for being on the Hoon. It's lovely to have you, and Rebecca there from the University of Canterbury. Thank you.
Thanks so much,
Thank
Rebecca.
you.
Yo, Dalipa, where are you?
I'm here. Hopefully, you can hear me loud and clear.
We can.
Yeah.
Excellent.
So you're wanting to talk about Gabe Newell, I hear.
Yeah, is he a mate of yours? He sounds like somebody who
Well,
would be a mate.
I'd like him to be a mate because I did write a story at one point about his. I think he's got the 24th biggest super yacht in the world, which was Rothanante, which was parked in Auckland silo for most of the COVID period. But what I also really liked about Rothanante was that it had a support vessel, a tender that was almost as big as the mothership, which is what's called an explorer super yacht, and it is basically an icebreaker, and it has all the toys and the helicopters and the slides and so on. But yeah, this is all about gaming, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
let's back a bit and also introduce Dalipa Fonseca from Business Desk to the show.
Knows Dalipa.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. And the reason I was keen to get Dalipa on is because he wrote a fantastic story on Business Desk today, which I've put a link into the invite for this Hoon, talking about the gaming industry, leading with the interesting calls from our gaming industry leaders for our government to pull finger and try to compete with the Australian government, which is providing subsidies for Australian gaming companies, in part to poach New Zealand gaming developers across the Tasman. Could you tell us about what the current situation in the gaming industry is, but also about that key moment during lockdowns when it looked like we had the rock star gaming industry in the world?
Yeah, well, I guess perhaps I can paint a picture for you because, this kind of story sort of started. I went to visit, Rocket Works, who are kind of the main, I guess, big high-profile gaming creators in Auckland CBD, and they are located right at the top of commercial bay. So their office is like something out of Star Trek or probably more accurately Star Wars, in terms of the sort of neon lights and all kinds of things at the entrance. And so I was just, having a conversation with him about with Stephen Knightley there, who's a chief operating officer there, and I was kind of asking him, well, how's the industry after COVID, and we kind of walked through the whole COVID situation and plus what it's like now. And the interesting thing about that I thought of the whole gaming industry is that during COVID, it was seen as or even before that, it was seen as a real potential growth industry for New Zealand. And we had a lot of opportunities that kind of came through during COVID. One of them was Peter's mate Gabe being basically stranded in New Zealand during sort of the early stages of the kind of pandemic. And then
just
the other
paint a picture of who Gabe is for those people who aren't gamers. I've heard something about Steam, but tell us what
yeah. So
Gabe
the Steam marketplace is basically the biggest marketplace. If you're a PC gamer, you will have a Steam account, and that's where all kinds of developers are basically you have to be on there if you're trying to sell your games basically to sort of the PC market, and so that's home for all kinds of indie kind of developers and everything. And the thing with Gabe that he mentioned, and he actually said this, I think, publicly in New Zealand at the time, was, he was getting calls from his employees because they were locked down overseas. He's getting calls from his employees who really wanted to move to New Zealand. And he said that he had applied for a residency. I'm not quite sure what exactly happened with that. I assume he met the income requirements, but in the end, it seems like it basically kind of hit the rocks on just not being able to bring people through the border and not being able to get the exceptions, even though, as we know, plenty of others were granted exceptions in plenty of other industries, from agriculture through to horticulture, through to through even a mountain biking tournament I saw were on the exceptions list. But that was one of the kind of missed opportunities. And there've been sort of others, and the gaming industry has been feeling, I guess, sort of that they have difficulty being heard as a kind of industry compared to others.
Dilika, do you think the government is it embarrassed about the Peter Thiel thing? Is that what stops them? Because I was aware that Gabe Newell was here. He also brought his mother out. He was stuck here and then decided to actually kind of base himself here, and he seemed like quite the asset. I don't know whether he ever said that his values were totally aligned to New Zealand the way Peter Thiel did, but do you think it's embarrassment about the Thiel case that makes the government a little slow off the mark with these kind of billionaires?
I actually wonder in Gabe's case, I think that could be a case in terms of there's a bit of hesitancy around these billionaires, but then again, they've got a super high net worth investor scheme running with Immigration New Zealand at the moment. We're trying to get investors in, and presumably Gabe would have qualified in that. But I think actually, if you cast your minds back to the beginning of the pandemic, there was sort of this, I think there was a kind of probably a level of naivety amongst us where we kind of assumed that we would be able to maintain that, that position sort of forever and never really have to consider letting, what the path out of it might be, and would we have to let, who would we have to let through the border, and we never really fully, grappled with those questions. So it kind of became a little bit about who shouted the loudest, who was inside the country, and I think that just probably nixed a lot of those sort of plans, because we couldn't really come up with any alternatives. But that was obviously a nice to have, and the gaming industry did well because during the time of COVID, they could actually collaborate in person at the beginning, and at a time when other gaming studios were basically stuck in their bedrooms, and then but
Well,
now they're worried.
Stuck in your bedroom to live.
Yeah. Very true. And then now they're worried because there are Australia has come to the party with some big tax rebates, and actually these are pretty common right around the world. But the issue is that they don't happen right across the Tasman, where we have a closer economic relations agreement, which makes it so much easier for New Zealanders to move over. And
they're taking
on top
our nurses and our billionaires.
Yeah, well, our future billionaire ideas, and the gaming industry makes makes a point that, well, you're giving subsidies to the film industry to have here, and you don't own the films come here. Lord of the Rings comes here. Well, Lord of the Rings is a slightly different situation, but Marvel movies come here. Quantum Mania or whatever. I don't know if they were one of them, but they come over here and. They film over here, and then but the IP is owned in the United States, whereas the gaming, these are studios who are developing ideas over here. So most of the profits will accrue over here. And but what they're saying is, well, with these tax breaks from Australia, and some of them run to 50. There's a kind of 20% sort of offset, which actually the thing hasn't been passed yet because it's a little bit complicated to run these. Calculate exactly. It's not like a movie with a video game. These things are always being updated. So these offsets get paid at the completion of a project. So
can I ask you, Dalipa and Bernard, as political experts as well, which I'm most certainly not, but as usual, doesn't stop me asking the question or talking about it. But when Jacinda left, did she take the testicles of this government with her as well? The metaphorical testicles. They seem to be stripping away any vestige of taking the initiative on anything. Sorry, I sound a bit Hoskinish there.
To be fair, the actual offset was announced by Scott Morrison, so just Ardern was in power at the time, and even though they hadn't implemented it then, they had actually signaled. What they've done is they've sent a signal. They're basically saying, well, once this thing actually passes, you're going to get your tax offset from July of, I think it was July of 2022, I think. So basically, they've been assured that once this goes through, they're going to get their offset. And on top of that, the states have a rebate as well. Yeah. And so, both now it's Hipkin's problem, but Ardern would have known that this was coming as well. And we haven't heard much about what exactly the government is planning to do. So all these video game studios are kind of washing the budget.
But what's happened here, though, is we have a group of people in Treasury and MB and the New Zealand Initiative who are locked into this sort of late 80s, mid 90s idea of this pure market economy where the government never subsidises anything, never picks a winner. And somehow that this is still the actual case. When we've just seen the United States government pass a bill through Congress to spend $1/3 of $1 trillion subsidising a transition to renewable energy. Australia's Conservative government, this is the pro-business government, supposedly all for pure free markets, was the one who provided this. And you'd think it would be a Labor government, as we saw during the early 2000s when it was Helen Clark's government that basically said, enough of this Treasury burping, we're going to subsidise our movie industry too and make sure we have a proper industry. And to be honest, our gaming industry is in part driven out of all of the digital work that was done on the movie industry. So there's quite a close connection here. And you could argue, well, if you are going to subsidise the movie industry, you might as well do the gaming industry as well. They are at least high-paid jobs for people who stay here and don't necessarily pollute the water table or anything else. And remember, when the government says that it doesn't, when people at the New Zealand Initiative and Treasury say that the government doesn't subsidise other industries, it's simply not true. Obviously, the agriculture industry and many others aren't included in the emissions trading scheme, and they should definitely be included. And of course, capital gains are not taxed. So if you're in the land business, residential or agricultural,
we're all in the land business one way or another.
Then that's subsidised effectively as well. So I think actually what the case here is not so much the government is afraid of doing big things. I just think it's locked in by a bunch of thinkers and ministries that have captured the government, and they don't know how to get out.
Did you see, Bernard, the interview with 103-year-old Roger Douglas railing against the lack of courage in the government and so on in the Herald? It was, he'll do that to in Queen Street on a Friday evening, but with a loud hailer. But.
Yeah, I mean, there's part of me as a 18, 19, 20-year-old growing up in New Zealand that was cheering Roger Douglas on. Get rid of that tyrant Robert Muldoon and free us all from the shackles of Muldoon's interference, and that was needed, a lot of that. But now we have to be pragmatic, and we have to actually fight to keep our people in New Zealand, particularly if they've got high paid jobs, and we've got an industry that actually has got a start and is doing well. And we're just saying to the Australians, here, you have them, it's fine, we're pure, we're wonderfully pure, but we're also bloody poor. And I wish we'd do something more about that. Anyway, Dileepa, it's been wonderful to have you on the show. Thank you very much for coming in. I better let you back to do some work. But also, thank you for writing this article that's on Business Desk, looking at not just an interesting situation with one of our most innovative industries with 1,000 high-paid jobs, but also an opportunity that we seem to have missed during the lockdown, when we could have, locked in the world's biggest gaming executive, and we just...
Well, we did lock him in on his own super yacht, two super yachts. Let's go back to the
No,
super
he had
yacht.
his own house. He wasn't even competing for housing.
And his mum.
And his mum. They could all be in New Zealand now, building, the steam version of the New Zealand gaming industry, and said we just let
Oh,
it...
they probably
let it
would have moved to, is it Timaru that's the capital of steampunk? They probably would have started branding on steampunk.
That's right. And there's a perfectly good dock there for his super yacht.
Here we go.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Dileepa. Lovely to see you.
Oh no, nice to see you. Thanks for the time.
Good to see you, Dileepa. Bye.
Good to see you, Peter.
So it's been a real lap around the traps this week: geopolitics, climate change, and our economics and gaming industry. Peter, what's really caught your eye this week? And I have to say, it's the thing that you and I both read avidly, and it's an extraordinary
The Rupert Murdoch story.
Yeah.
No, the Rupert Murdoch story is absolutely gorgeous because, of course, it's really a summation of everything we've known in a sense, except that it does seem to have some fabulous sources that I would say are emanating, even in a named way, from the much shunned Jerry Hall. And of course, it coincides. Now, look, I want to point out that I haven't watched the fourth series of Succession yet because I don't have a Neon subscription or a Sky subscription in the UK where I am. And so I'm very disappointed that I now have been reading obituaries of Logan Roy. So I know a bit of what happened. But
Spoiler alert!
One of the best aspects of the Vanity Fair story on Rupert Murdoch was that Jerry Hall's split agreement with Rupert included apparently a pact not to discuss with the writing room of Succession, any of the stories that she took out of Rupert. I mean, it is
such an
completely
extraordinary
ridiculous.
thing. So this is, of course, a feature about Rupert Murdoch that was written by Gabe Sherman. Is that right?
Yeah.
In the New York Magazine.
No, in Vanity Fair, and it's
Vanity
very,
Fair,
very
sorry.
detailed. What it's actually also particularly good on is the succession of Lachlan and the idea that when Rupert dies, he's 93 now, and of course he broke his. One of the saddest things in it is it's now become clear that Rupert really seriously hurt himself, broke his back on Lachlan's rather beautiful carbon fibre super yacht, and nearly died. And that Jerry nursed him back to health. Now, what's also weird about that is that you will remember, and we've shown, and there needs to be a kind of not safe for work image of this of Rupert's rather reptilian or amphibian body being hauled out of the water by Jerry Hall, and now there's an almost identical picture of his rather weird new fiancée or now ex-fiancée after 2 weeks doing the same with this kind of 93-year-old man in shorts, which is not a brilliant look. But Jerry Hall, appeared, nursed him to health. He had a very bad case of COVID, and then she was summarily fired by text.
That is the extraordinary thing. Is this
Or
article?
divorced by text, rather.
Yeah, which has the text with the the dumping, and this is someone who nursed him through COVID, feeding him spoons of soup, no doubt.
Yeah.
It is quite a thing. And for those who are following Succession and wondering, well, that sounds a lot like the Murdochs. And it does sound like the writers of Succession have got some pretty good sources in the Murdoch family. It is just the most extraordinary
Well, the other one that's
story.
actually brilliant in there is and somebody was talking to me about this, that Jerry Hall got a rather beautiful Oxfordshire home out of her out of the divorce. but then noticed that the security cameras were still beaming back to Fox in New York, and Mick Jagger's security people supposedly came and sorted that out for her. So she's still in good terms with Mick Jagger, it would appear.
Yeah, that is the thing. You've got the worlds of Mick Jagger, Rupert Murdoch, crossing.
You couldn't make it up because you don't have to. Yeah.
No, it's just the most extraordinary thing. I mean, both you and I, you were in closer proximity than me. I covered News Corporation in the early 90s as a company, and did a bunch of press conferences with Rupert Murdoch and Lachlan Murdoch when he was at that point favoured to be the one to take over. He then fell out, and James was the one who was going to take over. And that's the thing about this article, that it is littered with brutal things being said by James about the rest of the crew. That he refused to go to Rupert Murdoch's 90th birthday party.
Yeah.
And that it's, if you think Succession is over the top, it's not at all. This is this
No,
is
and let's
exactly how
also
it is.
remember that Rupert's mother Elizabeth, I think, lasted until 103. So we've got a good while from him yet. Although it'll be very interesting to see if he ends up being called into the Delaware court, where Dominion Voting Systems is suing Fox for $1.6 billion.
This could be
that's
the final
actually
moment.
not entirely material, and I suspect they will settle out of court, but it's fabulously embarrassing for the whole of Fox,
and he always
and not
seems
just Rupert.
I mean, that is the thing. In the coming week, we'll hear more about it, and it's one of those he dies, the world changes in quite a way. And it struck me also, I've been listening to the Empire over the last
very good.
couple of
Yes,
weeks,
one of my favourites.
which I'd
William
heartily
Dalrymple and
recommend.
Anita Anand. Yeah.
Which
Oh,
I'd
you think
heartily
you're relating his to the Ottoman Empire?
exactly.
Because so is Rupert Suleiman the Magnificent?
Could be, but more importantly, his father, Keith Murdoch, who founded the Adelaide Advertiser, which was the start of
Adelaide
Rupert
News.
Murdoch's Adelaide News.
Adelaide
Then
News.
eventually,
Bernard. Yeah, that's
didn't
why
he
it's called the
become
News
the
Corp.
Advertiser? Oh, yeah.
That's why it's called the News
But didn't he
Corporation.
take over the Advertiser? Is that right? Is that how
Well, I think he took over the Advertiser as part of Herald and Week when he was the chief executive of Herald and Weekly Times. But
That's
the
right.
Adelaide News was the one that he emerged with, which is why News Corporation used to be called the News Corp, and also why the News Corp logo is taken from Keith Murdoch's signature. His own writing style is why
didn't know
is the script that's used for News Corp these days.
Wow. And the reason I'm interested in this is that quite a bit of the podcast is about Gallipoli and about its key role in the First World
Keith
War.
wrote the Gallipoli myth,
Exactly.
created the Gallipoli myth, exactly.
And got heavily involved in the background in the British Parliament after Gallipoli to basically get rid of Churchill and that stuff.
But Rupert,
fascinating.
Bernard, the Murdochs have never asked anything of any politician in any country.
No.
They just give them things.
Yeah. Anyway, so I think it's a
So
fascinating
Bernard, do we do a skateboarding
story.
dog now? I mean,
yes,
Rupert
go
is a
for
bit
it.
of a skateboarding dog, but I just thought there was a little story that I picked up from my spin-off thing, which was that that global warming, global heating has apparently, according to Dartmouth College, increased over the last 10 years the number of home runs scored in top league baseball in the United States, because higher temperatures reduces the friction of objects flying through the air, and they're forecasting that over the next 10 years, that between the end of the next century, there was going to be a 94, potentially 95 more home runs per season than there are now because of climate change. So, as usual, there's an upside.
There's an upside. Yes, indeed.
And
Peter,
I hope
thank
that
you.
story isn't too much inside baseball, Bernard.
But don't. That's excellent. Peter, lovely to see you. Thank you very much for dialing in at some ungodly
And
hour
I'll
of
see
the
you
morning
in Italy
from.
next week.
Sorry?
I'll see you from Italy next week.
Oh, of course.
Possibly, I might try and arrange a more spectacular background.
Looking forward to it. Stay safe and enjoy, and we will talk again in a week's time on the Hoon. We also have Peter Bale from the Spanish Bureau of the Kaka, and this has been a Hoon.
It's Ke.
Down.
Yeah. Bye, Bernard.
Catch you.
El Hoon.
Bye bye. Ellen. Good stuff. Catch you later.
Bye.
Bye-bye.